28M, never thought that buying my dream home would turn into a psychological warfare campaign that would ultimately involve the federal government. But here we are. To understand how I ended up buying the house of the woman who tried to destroy my life, you need to understand the hell she put me through first. It all started about 1.5 years ago. My grandfather, who practically raised me, passed away and left me a very generous inheritance. I work as a forensic accountant, a job that requires me to track down missing money, uncover corporate fraud, and deal with highly complex financial documents. Because of my career, I've always been incredibly careful with my own money. I didn't blow the inheritance on sports cars or luxury vacations. Instead, I decided to invest it into something solid, real estate. After months of searching, I found the perfect place in a high-end, incredibly pristine suburban neighborhood called Oak Creek. It was a beautiful 4-bedroom house with a massive backyard, a wraparound porch, and enough space for me to finally set up a proper home office. I bought the house in cash. No mortgage, no debt. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, but I completely overlooked one massive, glaring red flag. The Oak Creek Homeowners Association, or HOA. When you buy a house in an HOA neighborhood, you agree to abide by their covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and Rs. I read through the Oak Creek rulebook before signing the papers. It was standard stuff. Don't paint your house neon pink, keep your lawn mowed, don't leave trash cans out for a week. I'm a quiet guy who likes things neat, so I didn't think it would be an issue. But a rulebook is only as reasonable as the person enforcing it. And the person enforcing the Oak Creek rules was a woman named Martha. Martha was the HOA president. She was a woman in her late 50s with that stereotypical, sharp, asymmetrical haircut that screams, "I need to speak to the manager." She drove a spotless white Mercedes SUV and treated the neighborhood like her own personal kingdom. From the very first day I moved in, Martha made it her mission to let me know I didn't belong. I was young, single, and worst of all in her eyes, I didn't fit the traditional family aesthetic of Oak Creek. The harassment began on day 3. I was still unpacking boxes in my living room when I saw Martha marching up my driveway. She had a clipboard in her hand and a scowl on her face. I opened the door with a friendly smile, introducing myself as the new owner. She didn't even shake my hand. Instead, she looked me up and down, squinted at my moving boxes, and said, "We have standards in Oak Creek. Moving pods are only allowed in the driveway for 48 hours. Yours has been here for 50. I'm issuing a formal warning. Next time, it's a $500 fine." I apologized, explaining that the moving company was delayed in picking it up, but she just turned around and marched away. 2 days later, I received my first actual fine in the mail. It wasn't for the moving pod. It was a $250 penalty because my trash cans were visible from the street at 7 a.m. on garbage day. The pickup wasn't until 8 a.m., but according to Martha's personal interpretation of the rules, putting them out before the sun was fully up was a violation. I was annoyed, but I paid it. I just wanted peace. That was my first critical mistake. In Martha's mind, my compliance didn't mean I was a good neighbor. It meant I was weak. It meant I was a target. Over the next 2 months, the fines became absolutely unhinged. I received a $500 fine because the grass on my front lawn was measured at 2.5 inches instead of the regulation maximum of 2.25 inches. She literally walked onto my property with a ruler. A week later, another $800 fine arrived because the shade of white I used to touch up my front door did not match the pre-approved Oak Creek color palette. I had used standard gloss white. She claimed it was eggshell. Every time I tried to appeal these fines to the HOA board, I was shut down. The board consisted of Martha and 2 of her closest friends who just nodded along with whatever she said. I was losing my mind, but I kept paying, thinking she would eventually get bored and move on to someone else. But she didn't get bored. The fines kept coming, escalating in price and absurdity. And then I found out the real reason why she was doing it. She didn't just want to make me miserable. She wanted my house. The breaking point didn't happen over grass height or trash cans. It happened over a fence. I have a dog, a golden retriever mix, and I wanted to let him run around safely in my own backyard. I submitted a formal, detailed request to the HOA board to install a standard 6-foot wooden privacy fence. The CC&Rs explicitly allowed this exact type of fence. I even used the specific contractor the HOA recommended in their welcome packet. I paid the guy $4,000. He did a fantastic job, and my dog was finally happy. 2 days after the fence was finished, I came home from work to find a bright red notice of violation and immediate removal taped directly to my freshly painted front door. The notice claimed that my fence was unauthorized and disrupted the visual harmony of the Oak Creek community. The fine? A staggering $2,500, plus a daily penalty of $100 until I completely tore it down. I was furious. I immediately called Martha. She answered on the second ring, sounding incredibly smug. I told her I had submitted the paperwork, waited the required time, and used their approved contractor. She calmly informed me that the board had convened an emergency meeting while I was at work and decided to retroactively deny my application because my specific lot was suddenly deemed a premium open sightline property. This is when the red flags finally connected in my head. A $2,500 fine and daily compounding penalties for an approved fence wasn't just a power trip. It was a targeted financial attack. I started talking to my neighbors, specifically the ones who were too afraid of Martha to ever speak up at the monthly meetings. One evening, an older gentleman named Arthur, who lived 2 doors down, caught me while I was checking my mail. He looked around nervously before whispering, "She's trying to price you out, son. She wants you gone." Arthur explained that Martha's nephew, a guy in his early 20s who had just dropped out of college, was desperately looking for a house in the area. But Oak Creek was expensive, and her nephew had absolutely no money. Martha had publicly promised her sister that she would secure a property for him at a fraction of the market value. How was she planning to do that? By using the HOA's most aggressive, legally terrifying weapon, foreclosure. If a homeowner accumulates enough unpaid fines, legal fees, and liens on their property, the HOA can legally foreclose on the house, auction it off to recover the debt, and kick the rightful owner out. Martha was intentionally burying me in fake violations so she could force my house into an HOA auction where her nephew could swoop in and buy my fully paid-off dream home for pennies on the dollar. I went back inside and looked at the stack of notices on my kitchen counter. The trash cans, the grass height, the paint color, the fence, the daily penalties were compounding fast. She had already slapped over $6,000 in fines and liens on my property in less than 4 months. If I refused to take down the fence and refused to pay these extortionate fees, she would absolutely initiate foreclosure proceedings. She thought I was just some dumb, naive kid with a lucky inheritance who would either panic and sell the house cheap to escape the nightmare or lose it entirely to her legal trap. She underestimated exactly who she was messing with. As a forensic accountant, my entire career is built on destroying people who think they can hide their financial crimes behind paperwork and bureaucracy. I don't get mad, and I don't throw tantrums. I build airtight, undeniable legal cases that send arrogant people to federal prison. If Martha wanted to play a game of paperwork and legal threats, I was going to show her what a professional looks like. I decided right then and there. I wasn't just going to fight the fines. I was going to completely dismantle her board, and her entire life. The first step in any forensic investigation is gathering public records. The Oak Creek HOA was registered as a nonprofit corporation in our state. By law, homeowners are entitled to review the financial records, meeting minutes, and vendor contracts. I sent a formal, legally binding request via certified mail to the HOA management company, demanding full access to the last 5 years of financial ledgers. I cited the exact state statutes. Martha tried to block it, of course. She sent me a condescending email claiming the records were confidential and sealed for resident privacy. That was a blatant lie and highly illegal. I replied with a letter drafted by a ruthless real estate attorney friend of mine, threatening an immediate lawsuit and a forced audit by the state's attorney general if the documents weren't handed over within 48 hours. That did the trick. 2 days later, a massive, heavy cardboard box of printed spreadsheets, receipts, and bank statements was aggressively dumped on my porch. It was thousands of disorganized pages. They probably thought the sheer volume of chaotic paperwork would overwhelm me, and I'd just give up. They had no idea that a box of messy financial records is my equivalent of a playground. I opened my laptop, cracked my knuckles, and started following the money. The box was a complete disaster. It was intentionally disorganized, a classic tactic used by people trying to hide financial discrepancies. There were coffee stains on ledgers, missing months of bank statements, and hundreds of crumpled, faded receipts for things like office supplies and event planning. Any normal homeowner would have taken one look at this mountain of garbage, gotten a massive headache, and completely given up. But for a forensic accountant, this is a puzzle waiting to be solved. I spent the entire weekend digitizing every single piece of paper. I scanned them, ran them through OCR software to make the text searchable, and built a massive interconnected Excel database. I cross-referenced the HOA's bank withdrawals with the cleared checks and the submitted invoices. For the first 2 days, I didn't find the smoking gun. I found plenty of incompetence. Double paid utility bills, late fees on insurance premiums, and terrible bookkeeping, but nothing that screamed malicious fraud. Martha was arrogant, but she wasn't completely stupid. She knew how to make things look reasonably legitimate on the surface. But on day 3, late Sunday night, I found the loose thread. And once I pulled it, her entire empire began to unravel. It started with the landscaping. Oak Creek is a nice neighborhood, and we have a lot of common areas that need mowing, weeding, and seasonal planting. According to the ledgers, the HOA was paying a company called Greenleaf Property Maintenance LLC approximately $14,000 every single month. That's $168,000 a year just for grass and bushes in a neighborhood of only 80 homes. It was absurdly high. I pulled up the invoices from Greenleaf. They were incredibly vague. Instead of itemizing the labor, materials, and specific locations, the invoices just said things like monthly grounds upkeep or seasonal enhancements. I decided to look up Greenleaf Property Maintenance on the Secretary of State's Business Registry website. The company was registered to a generic P.O. box in a town about 40 miles away. There was no physical storefront, no website, and no listed phone number. The registered agent for the LLC was a man named Richard Vance. The name didn't immediately ring a bell, so I ran a quick public records background check on Mr. Vance. It took less than 5 minutes to find out that Richard Vance resided at the exact same address as Martha, our beloved, terrifying HOA president. Richard was her husband. Martha was using her position as the sole decider of HOA contracts to hire her own husband's fake landscaping company at a massively inflated rate. But she didn't stop there. Once I knew what to look for, the P.O. box and the Vance name, I found 2 more shell companies. One was Oak Creek Legal Consulting, which billed the HOA $5,000 a month for compliance reviews, and the other was Premier Structural Assessments, which charged the neighborhood a flat $50,000 a year to supposedly inspect the community clubhouse and pool for safety hazards. All of these companies were secretly owned by Richard. I sat back in my chair and looked at the final tally on my spreadsheet. Over the last 5 years, Martha and her husband had siphoned just over $1.2 million out of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association reserve funds and operating budget. They were taking the mandatory dues from 80 families and funneling it directly into their own pockets through fake vendor contracts. This wasn't just a bossy neighbor on a power trip anymore. This was a highly orchestrated million-dollar embezzlement scheme. It was federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and grand larceny. And suddenly, her pristine white Mercedes SUV and the massive, expensive renovations on her own property made perfect sense. She was living a luxury lifestyle funded entirely by the neighbors she terrorized. While I was staring at the undeniable proof of a massive federal crime, my doorbell rang. It was 8 a.m. on a Monday. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Martha's crony, the HOA vice president, taping another brightly colored envelope to my door. I waited for him to walk away before I grabbed it. It was a formal notice of a $1,000 fine and an intent to place a lien on my property. The violation? Failure to maintain uniform window treatments. Apparently, having my bedroom blinds drawn at a slightly different angle than my living room blinds was a disruption to the community aesthetic. She was still trying to steal my house for her nephew. She was still aggressively pushing forward with the fake fines to trigger a foreclosure. She thought she was untouchable. She had no idea that I had just downloaded her entire life into a single flash drive, and I was about to introduce her to the federal government. I had the evidence. Over $1 million in fraudulent vendor payments routed directly into Martha's household over 5 years. But having the evidence and knowing what to do with it are two very different things. My first instinct was to print out the spreadsheets, march into the next monthly HOA meeting, and throw the binder onto the table in front of the entire neighborhood. I wanted to see the look on her face when she realized she was caught. I wanted to watch her squirm and try to explain away the shell companies in front of 80 angry homeowners. But my professional training kicked in and stopped me. Confronting a fraudster directly is the absolute worst thing you can do. It gives them time. It gives them a chance to panic, shred documents, delete hard drives, and transfer funds to offshore accounts. If I showed my hand too early, Martha and her husband Richard would destroy the evidence trail. I needed a surgical strike, not a public screaming match. Plus, the HOA board was entirely comprised of Martha's hand-picked loyalists. Even if I exposed her, they would likely try to cover it up to protect themselves from liability. No, this wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was a federal crime involving wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement. I didn't need a homeowners meeting. I needed the United States government. I spent the next 3 days compiling what we in the industry call a suspicious activity report, but on steroids. I organized every single fraudulent invoice, matched it with the corresponding cleared bank check from the HOA account, and linked it directly to Richard Vance's LLC registration documents. I created clear, easy-to-read flowcharts that visually demonstrated how the money was moving from our neighborhood reserve fund into Martha's personal mortgage payments and luxury car leases. I bound it all in a thick, professional dossier. On a Tuesday morning, I took a personal day from work. I didn't go to the local police department. Local cops don't handle complex, multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. Instead, I drove downtown to the regional field office of the FBI. I also made a duplicate copy for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, because if there's one thing fraudsters always forget to do, it's pay taxes on their stolen money. Al Capone didn't go down for murder, he went down for tax evasion. Walking into an FBI field office as a civilian is an intimidating experience, but I knew exactly what to say. I asked to speak with an agent in the white-collar crime squad. After waiting for about an hour in a sterile lobby, I was led into a small conference room by a stern-looking agent named Miller. I slid the massive binder across the table. I didn't give him an emotional story about my fence or my trash cans. I just gave him the math. "Agent Miller," I said, "I have documented evidence of a $1.2 million embezzlement scheme utilizing interstate wire transfers and shell companies orchestrated by the president of a 501c4 nonprofit organization." Agent Miller opened the binder. He looked at the flow charts, scanned the bank routing numbers, and read the LLC filings. I watched his eyes widen slightly. In the world of federal investigations, cases usually take months to build from scratch. I had just handed him a fully completed, perfectly documented case on a silver platter. He looked up at me and asked one question. "Who else knows about this?" I told him nobody. Just me. He nodded, closed the binder, and gave me strict instructions. "Do not confront her. Do not stop paying your regular HOA dues. Act completely normal. If she finds you, let us know, but do not escalate. We will take it from here." The hardest part wasn't building the case. The hardest part was the waiting. Federal investigations move incredibly slowly. They have to subpoena bank records legally, get warrants, and build an airtight prosecution. For the next 3 months, I had to live in Oak Creek, smiling politely at the woman who was actively trying to steal my home, knowing she was a millionaire thief. And Martha did not let up. Believing I was completely defeated by her box of paperwork, she accelerated her timeline. The fines became daily occurrences. A leaf blew onto my driveway, $50. My garage door was open for more than 15 minutes, $100. She even hired a tow truck to try and remove my contractor's van when I had a plumber over for an emergency leak. The psychological toll of pretending to be a victim was exhausting. I watched my neighbors cower in fear every time her white Mercedes rolled down the street. I saw Arthur, the older gentleman who had warned me, getting berated by Martha on his front lawn because his grandchildren had left a plastic tricycle on the porch. I had to bite my tongue so hard it bled to stop myself from walking over there and telling her it was all over. By the end of the 3rd month, the fraudulent liens on my property totaled over $15,000. She sent me a certified letter stating that the HOA board had officially voted to begin foreclosure proceedings on my house to recover the debt. Her nephew had even been seen driving slowly past my house, taking pictures of the windows, already measuring the curtains. They thought they had won. Every time I received a new fine, I scanned it and quietly emailed it to Agent Miller. Every fake lien she placed on my house was just another count of mail fraud added to her impending federal indictment. I was the bait, and she was swallowing the hook whole. The morning it all came crashing down was a beautifully crisp Thursday in late October. It was exactly 6:15 a.m. According to the Oak Creek CC&Rs, the neighborhood was supposed to be completely silent until 7 a.m. No lawnmowers, no construction, no loud music. But the federal government doesn't care about Martha's noise ordinances. I was standing in my kitchen, brewing my morning coffee and staring out the front window, wondering if today would bring another fake fine for having my porch light too dim. Instead, I heard the low, heavy rumble of multiple large engines turning onto our street. It wasn't the garbage trucks. It was a convoy. 3 black, unmarked Chevy Suburbans, a large white evidence box truck, and 2 local police cruisers rolled down the pristine asphalt of Oak Creek. They didn't have their sirens on, but the red and blue lights were silently flashing, reflecting off the manicured trees. I watched, my heart pounding with pure, unadulterated adrenaline as the convoy pulled directly up to Martha's massive corner lot mansion. They didn't park politely on the street. The lead SUV drove right up over the curb, its heavy tires sinking deep into Martha's perfectly measured 2.25-inch premium grass, leaving massive muddy ruts. The doors flew open before the vehicles even fully stopped. At least 15 agents poured out. They were wearing dark tactical windbreakers with large, bold yellow letters on the back, FBI and IRS-CI, Criminal Investigation. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision. Half of the agents immediately formed a perimeter around the property, while a specialized entry team marched straight up to Martha's custom-painted Oak Creek standard white double front doors. They didn't ring the doorbell. They didn't knock politely. One of the agents swung a heavy black steel battering ram, and with a sickening crunch of splintering wood, the $10,000 custom doors flew wide open. The agents swarmed inside, yelling commands that echoed down the silent, sleeping street. FBI, search warrant! Keep your hands where we can see them! I grabbed my coffee mug and stepped out onto my front porch to get a better view. Within seconds, doors all up and down the street started creeping open. Neighbors stepped out in their robes and pajamas, clutching newspapers and staring in absolute shock. Arthur, the older gentleman who lived 2 doors down from me, walked out onto his lawn, his jaw practically hitting the grass. For about 20 minutes, there was organized chaos inside the house. Agents started carrying out cardboard boxes filled with files, binders, laptops, and hard drives, loading them into the white box truck. Then, a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck reversed up the street. The driver hopped out, walked up to Martha's spotless white Mercedes SUV and Richard's luxury sports car parked in the driveway, and started hooking them up to the winches. Asset forfeiture. Because the cars were bought with embezzled funds, they now belong to the United States Treasury. And then, the moment of absolute poetic justice arrived. The front door opened again, and Martha was brought out. She was not wearing her usual sharp power suit. She was wearing a silk bathrobe, fuzzy slippers, and her asymmetrical hair was a tangled, chaotic mess. Her hands were cuffed tightly behind her back. Richard was brought out right after her, looking completely pale and terrified, flanked by 2 IRS agents. Martha was absolutely losing her mind. Even in handcuffs facing federal agents, her entitled arrogance couldn't be turned off. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing off the houses. "Do you know who I am? I am the president of this homeowners association. You cannot park those trucks on my grass. You are violating the CC&Rs. I will fine all of you. I will have you evicted." Agent Miller, the man I had handed the binder to months ago, was standing on the driveway watching the cars get towed. He didn't even flinch at her screaming. He just turned to her, pulled out a document, and spoke in a calm, booming voice that the whole street could hear. "Martha Vance, you and your husband are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement of over $1.2 million. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it." They practically had to drag her to the back of the cruiser. As they pushed her into the back seat, she locked eyes with me standing on my porch. She stopped struggling for just a second. I didn't say a word. I didn't gloat. I just raised my coffee mug, gave her a very slow, polite nod, and took a sip. Her face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before in nature. The cruiser door slammed shut, cutting off her screaming, and they drove her away. The silence that fell over Oak Creek after the convoy left was deafening. Nobody moved for a solid minute. Then, Arthur slowly walked over to my property line. He looked at the muddy tire tracks destroying Martha's lawn, then looked at me. "What on earth just happened?" he asked, completely bewildered. I smiled, took another sip of my coffee, and said, "Turns out, Arthur, the landscaping budget was just a little too high this year. The immediate aftermath of the FBI raid was like watching a dictatorship collapse in real time. For the first 48 hours, Oak Creek was buzzing with rumors. Nobody knew exactly why Martha and Richard were dragged out in handcuffs, but everyone knew it was serious. The real panic, however, didn't come from the neighborhood. It came from the 2 remaining HOA board members. Martha's loyal cronies who had spent the last 5 years rubber stamping every single ridiculous, fine, and fraudulent landscaping contract she put in front of them. By Friday evening, every resident in Oak Creek received a frantic mass email from the HOA management portal. It was a joint statement from the vice president and the treasurer immediately resigning their positions, effective completely and permanently, claiming they were shocked and deeply saddened by recent unforeseen legal developments. They were desperately trying to distance themselves from the blast zone, but the FBI already had the ledgers I provided. Agents showed up at both of their houses the very next week for routine questioning. It turned out they weren't in on the actual embezzlement. They were just incredibly lazy cowards who liked the tiny bit of power Martha gave them. Still, because they had legally signed off on the fraudulent budgets without ever verifying the shell companies, they were hit with massive civil lawsuits for breaching their fiduciary duties. They both ended up selling their houses and moving away in disgrace just to pay their legal fees. A month later, Agent Miller from the FBI held a town hall meeting at the local community center for all Oak Creek residents. I sat in the back row, sipping a bottled water, watching the chaos unfold. Miller stood at the podium and laid it all out. He explained the fake P.O. boxes, the shell companies, and the $1.2 million that had been siphoned directly out of our reserve funds to pay for Martha's luxury cars, designer clothes, and her massive home renovations. The room erupted. People were furious, yelling and demanding their money back. But underneath the anger, there was a massive collective wave of relief. Because the entire HOA board was either indicted or resigned in disgrace, a judge ordered the immediate suspension of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association pending a full federal audit. Every single fine Martha had issued over the last 5 years was declared null and void. My $15,000 in compounding daily penalties evaporated into thin air. The lien on my house was officially removed from the county records by a federal judge. And my 6-foot wooden privacy fence, it was retroactively approved and permitted. My dog finally got to enjoy the yard in peace. But the story doesn't end with me just getting my fines cleared. The justice system still had to deal with Martha and Richard. When you are hit with a forensic accounting case built by a professional, there is no wiggle room. The paper trail I handed the FBI was so airtight, so overwhelmingly detailed, that their high-priced defense attorneys didn't even try to take it to trial. Facing up to 20 years in federal prison, they took a plea deal. Richard, who was technically the owner of the shell companies, took the heavier hit. 8 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Martha, the mastermind, got 5 years in a minimum security federal facility. But the IRS Criminal Investigation Division doesn't just put you in jail. They want their money back, and they want it with interest. Martha and Richard had spent the $1.2 million as fast as they stole it. They didn't have the cash sitting in a bank account to pay the government restitution. So the United States Marshal Service stepped in to liquidate their assets. First went the cars, then went the designer jewelry. And finally, the crown jewel of Martha's stolen empire, her house. Because she had used embezzled funds to pay off her mortgage and fund extensive luxury upgrades, the house was seized under federal asset forfeiture laws. It was the ultimate poetic irony. The woman who had spent months weaponizing fake HOA violations to illegally foreclose on my house so she could give it to her nephew was now having her own home legally foreclosed on by the United States government. About 4 months after the raid, a crew of federal contractors arrived at Martha's empty mansion. They didn't care about the 2.25-inch grass rule. They hammered thick wooden stakes into the pristine front lawn and hung a massive, heavy vinyl banner across the front porch columns. It was bright red and white, with bold black letters that could be read from down the street. Seized property, U.S. Marshals Service, public auction. I stood on my porch and stared at that sign for a long time. I looked at my bank account. I had my grandfather's remaining inheritance, which had been sitting safely in a high-yield index fund, plus my own substantial savings from my accounting career. I didn't need a second house. But as I looked at that massive foreclosed mansion, a completely unhinged, brilliantly petty idea started forming in my head. I wasn't just going to watch her lose everything. I was going to own it. The United States Marshal Service public auctions are usually pretty straightforward affairs. They don't happen on the front lawn with a guy speaking incredibly fast into a microphone like in the movies. They happen at the county courthouse or online. I registered as a bidder for the property located at 101 Oak Creek Drive. Because the house was seized to pay back the federal government and the IRS, they weren't looking to maximize the sale price. They just wanted to liquidate the asset quickly to cover the $1.2 million in restitution. The starting bid was set absurdly low, about 40% of the actual market value of the luxury mansion. I had the liquid capital ready. I transferred my savings, cashed out the remaining portion of my grandfather's inheritance, and waited for the auction to open. There were a few other investors interested, of course, flipper companies looking for a quick profit. But I had a distinct advantage. I lived right down the street. I knew the neighborhood was currently without an active HOA, which meant property values were temporarily in flux, scaring off some of the more conservative corporate buyers. When the bidding started, I didn't hesitate. I aggressively countered every single bid that came in. It wasn't just a real estate investment for me. It was the final, undeniable victory over the woman who tried to ruin my life. After about 45 tense minutes of escalating numbers on my computer screen, the hammer fell. I won. I had officially, legally bought the 6,000 square foot custom mansion of the dictator who tried to steal my house. 2 weeks later, I had the title in hand. I walked up her driveway, the same driveway where she had threatened me with $500 fines for my moving pod, and unlocked the custom front doors. The house was completely empty, stripped of all her stolen luxury furniture. I stood in her massive living room and just laughed. It was the most satisfying echo I had ever heard. But I didn't want to live there. My house was perfectly fine, and my dog loved his new fence. I needed to do something much more poetic with Martha's former palace. I decided to turn it into a rental property. But I wasn't going to rent it to just anyone. I was looking for a very specific type of tenant. I put an ad online offering a massive discount on rent for a luxury home, with only one specific condition. The tenants had to be exactly the kind of people Martha would have absolutely despised. It took about a week to find the perfect match. A lovely, incredibly chaotic family of 6 moved in. They had 4 loud, energetic kids who loved playing drums and riding dirt bikes. They owned 3 massive rescue dogs that barked at the mailman. And the absolute best part? The father was an eccentric artist who collected vintage, neon-colored lawn ornaments. Within a month, the pristine 2.25-inch grass that Martha had worshipped was covered in a small army of plastic pink flamingos, a giant inflatable dinosaur, and an entire village of incredibly ugly, mismatched lawn gnomes. Because the Oak Creek HOA had been completely dissolved by the state following the embezzlement scandal, there were no rules against it. There was no one to issue fines, no one to measure the grass, no one to complain about the neon pink flamingos. The neighborhood was finally free. Arthur and I still grab coffee on my porch sometimes, watching the new family's kids race their bikes up and down the street. It's loud, it's messy, and it's beautifully normal. As for Martha, she is currently residing in a federal correctional facility in a neighboring state. I looked up the prison regulations out of sheer curiosity. The inmates are required to wear identical khaki uniforms. Their cells must be kept to a strict, standardized level of cleanliness, and they have absolutely no control over their daily schedule. It seems she finally found a community with rules strict enough to satisfy her. But this time, she isn't the one holding the clipboard. And her nephew? He never did get a house in Oak Creek. I heard he's renting a tiny studio apartment above a bowling alley. So, if you ever find yourself living next to a tyrant who thinks a clipboard and a fake rulebook make them invincible, just remember, everyone leaves a paper trail. You just have to be patient enough to follow it. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about absolute nuclear revenge.